Hello everyone, this is Lyssa Holt here. I'm with my husband Ronald Holt, and we're going to talk a little bit today about his latest work. It's called Quantum Navigation, and I know the name sounds kind of fancy, but when we were trying to think about what to call this work, it seemed like the most appropriate name, and you'll see why after we talk about it a little bit. Basically speaking, and we'll get into it a little bit more later, quantum navigation is a way to go within your own consciousness and navigate your own landscape. Our inner landscape is usually made up of a lot of things that have to do with our belief systems, our old pain, the things that keep us trapped. And within our consciousness, sometimes it's very much like that landscape becomes metaphorical. So there's a lot of imagery and a lot of symbols and a lot of archetypes that reveal themselves within our consciousness as we do this type of work. And understanding how to navigate and interpret those experiences can really lead us to our awakening in a very empowered way, and also a very fascinating way as well. Would you say that that's somewhat...
Well, you summed it up very nicely.
Really?
Yes.
Okay, why don't you define also what you see quantum navigation is?
Well...
It is a meditation process, but it's more than that.
It's much more than that. Basically speaking, we have two different aspects of ourselves. One of those selves we're all very familiar with because we have grown it over time. And in growing it, it took us a while to pull together all of the reflections of ourself that we could determine that was us. And so this form of identification through our history and through our experiences gave us an impression of our identity and personality. And this began from the beginning we came onto the planet. Okay?
This lifetime or other
this lifetime and other lifetimes in all actuality.
Yeah.
Okay. So that's one aspect, and we're very familiar with that. Now, there is another aspect to us that has been around since the beginning of time and even before that. And that part takes a little time to get familiar with.
You're talking about our pure consciousness.
Our pure self,
okay.
Our pure consciousness. Mm-hmm. Yes, correct. Now, in our training, some of the Taoist training that we went through, there's a particular adage that they used, and that is that they were trying to help us identify the difference between what they called consciousness, which is the part of us that's been around forever, and the part of us that's mind. And that's the part we engineered as we grew up in these bodies.
It's also the personality.
It's the personality and our history, our identification, our sense of identification. Now, imagine if we were in a fun house of mirrors, okay? And we imagine that the first models for our behavior were our parents. And so let's say that they emulated being in that fun house of mirrors. And our parents, moment by moment, change shape as the mirrors change shape. And you know, when you look in the reflection and you're trying to get a bead on what you are, reflecting off of your parent, then you get this identification that's distorted. And you don't realize, because you feel your parents are perfect models of behavior, and they cannot be wrong. So as a child, you don't know anything different. And so you take your reflection, both psychologically and emotionally, from your parents, but you don't realize that they're changing the distortion ratio that they're reflecting at you, because they have a host of pressures on their shoulders, and they haven't explored and identified and disentangled from their own psychological and emotional stories, which create belief systems, and this then leads them into their distorted sense of self-identification.
So basically, from the time we come onto the planet, we're never given clear models how to navigate our lives as humans, emotionally and mentally and even spiritually.
Correct. So, without a model, a good model, you can imagine that you're left in the state of disorientation, always trying to change your psychological and emotional status in order to get the approval of the people around you. Mm-hmm. And you started this from your parents. So anyway, it goes back actually even further than that, but that's what we explore inside of quantum navigation. Now, as we start to develop our spiritual practice, we get more and more familiar with moving into that very still state, very quiet state, very detached, and consequentially, very fulfilled state. It's at that point that you start to identify with a different you, and that is the original you. Now, in the Taoist spiritual practice, we do a lot of different exercises, as you well know. Some of the
very hard physical
some
exercises.
Of the very difficult exercises we would do in holding postures for a long period of time until you, as they said, go beyond the mind, go beyond the emotions, go beyond the body. And there you find the true you.
But in quantum navigation, we don't do those types of physical practices.
Don't do that type of spirit. It's still possible to delineate the fine difference between mind and consciousness. So, with the mind, as the Taoists say, you cannot change the mind with the mind. You cannot change the emotions with the mind. But you can change the mind and the emotions with the body to a very nice degree. And they don't tell you till later, until you have a whole lot of practice, that once you identify the fine difference between mind and consciousness, then from consciousness you can change the mind, the body, and the emotions.
Okay, stop for a minute. I want to make sure I understand what you're saying is that quantum navigation is a way for us to learn how to differentiate between our true nature, our true consciousness, and all the other facades that are covering or obscuring the true nature of our consciousness.
Yes.
Okay, so if you've noticed then, the name quantum navigation, it has two parts. And within the quantum navigation workshops that you do, both of those parts are explored. So I would say, because I've been one of his guinea pigs in learning this process for the last several years, I would say then that what you're offering, first of all, is an understanding of quantum consciousness and what quantum consciousness really means, what it feels like to experience it so that you can understand when you're there, right?
Yes.
And some of this also will include some lectures on, don't get scared, but not so much quantum theory, but quantum understanding as it relates to consciousness.
Exactly.
Right. Then part two, I'm going to let you jump in a minute because this is just coming out right now. Part two is the navigation part. So the navigation part is that once you have learned what it feels like to become the quantum consciousness that you are, and usually it's through a meditation practice, then once you're there, what do you do? Or even though it's not a doing, what do you experience and how can you utilize that state of consciousness for your own healing and your own awakening? Is that true?
That's correct.
Okay.
Now, right on that cusp of mind and the fine line delineating consciousness is the boundary of the quantum. So all the practices that we did when we were doing the Taoist practice and many other practices led us to incorporating first the mind and the emotions and the body. And specifically, they wanted us to do practices that incorporated all of these all at once, moving all together into the quantum. Now, once you're inside of that quantum field, there is an aspect of you when you're at the most still. So this is very much like a pond. When a pond is moving and the currents are flowing and the wind is blowing on it, generating a lot of waves, it's generating a lot of turbulence in there, so it's picking up dirt and it's spreading it throughout the whole body of the water. In that case, you can't see very far. Now, the process of stilling, which is yogic in nature, stilling the mind, stilling the emotions, stilling the body, enables all that turbidity then to drop down into the bottom. Once that is done, then you can see clearly the whole body. You're nice and still. And at that moment, you feel the most fulfilled. So we learn the process of getting to that point, and from that point then, you start to hear differently. It's a not doing.
Right.
So it is a process of deepening the stillness and not doing process, so that you incorporate mind and emotions coming together, integrating and spreading your very sensitive feelers out into the great body of the ocean that surrounds us of quantum. When that happens, that's when you start hearing the guidance for your exact next steps to start to disentangle and unravel from the belief systems that have worked them way into the cement of beliefs. So we start disassembling the stories that lead to the belief systems, and then we start to see that all of these belief systems, they're like roots feeding your own inner tyrant. And that inner tyrant is the one that's always on your shoulder, that always is telling you, you can never do anything right, you can never do it good enough, and it's always pushing you so hard in the doership.
So basically, our true nature is quantum.
Yes.
This means that in order to travel and unfurl ourselves within that quantum state of consciousness, we can't bring the ego with us, can we?
No. Now, one of the most important aspects of this is seeing, if you notice that 3D has an X, Y, and Z. So X and Y is the two dimensions of length and width, and Z is the height. So we have these three major poles, okay? And these three major poles, these three axes are
Whatever.
basically our dualistic natures. Our duals want to come together, like yin and yang. They want to flow into each other and come home. But it's our unconsciousness, our unconscious resistance built through those stories into belief systems working against us that keep them separated and keep the dualities fighting in competition for dominance. So the inner child fights the adult until compassionate understanding sees that they need each other and they find their way home working in unison.
So it's about bringing our dualities together as well.
Right.
Because in quantum consciousness, you can't operate from duality.
Exactly.
Okay.
So at this point, the Quantum Navigator helps to disassemble all of those stories we made when we were a child, and actually even earlier. And those stories, repeated over time, making the hodgepodge quilt of personality and identity, they built into belief systems, and it's those belief systems that keep the yin from coming into yang. And in this case, it keeps the inner child from coming home and feeling at one with and stopping the competition between the adult, the masculine and the feminine within each of us. They find peace, and that makes the space giving us the lessons of how to disentangle and how to begin to build the bridges between our dualities so that higher self can now begin to work with the ego part of ourself, begin to integrate all of our past, all of our stories with absolute compassion.
Okay, I said there were two parts. So I said there was the quantum part, which we've talked about, but of course we would go much more into this in a workshop. The other part is the navigation part. And I can talk about this from my own experience, because when I started to do this work with you, and especially when you learn to get really quiet and to listen within your consciousness, because sometimes things come up that seem like they're coming out of nowhere, but they become like a thread. And if you start pulling the thread, then in a sense you get guided how to navigate directly to the issue that they're pointing to.
And in this case, the Quantum Navigator helps you work not in a linear way, but in a fashion that leads to working holographically and fractally towards the main issue, the core issue that disassembles all of the stories and the belief systems and helps you integrate and incorporate your dualities all into you.
Now, some people have asked, is the Quantum Navigator the higher self? And I've thought about this quite a lot, and I could say yes and no, I guess, because we have this image of the higher self as this overlord being, you know, that is pushing us here and there. But it's more of the idea of the all-pervasive, all-permeating consciousness that we are, that always guides us exactly where we need to go for our own awakening if we are paying attention, really.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
The amazing thing is that when we started doing this work together with some other friends, that I would from time to time have these experiences that were almost like psychedelic without the mushrooms that led me deep into my own consciousness in order to see my belief systems and the things that I was using to harm myself in this world, really, which we all have. So that's the navigation part.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
So put together we have quantum navigation. So as you said before, we have been taught systems. How to do this. This meditation process, 1 step, 2 step, 3 step, etc. That's linear. That's for another level of evolution for human beings. At some point we move out of linearity, out of steps, right? And we then have to move into more of this quantum state, which is a state of surrender, not a state of doing. And that's part of what's worked on in the workshop, right?
Yes, exactly. So as a child, when we face these dramatic challenges, we started to close down the emotional body. And because it was so painful, and as children, we were so vastly wide open, and our joy was so right present with us. Now, as we started to experience these traumas, that started shutting down, and we started a process of moving up into the mental body. We started moving into logic and reason, because logic and reason,
they're safe.
They're safe, yes. And so we've gotten to the point where we think about our feelings, but we're not really energizing our capacity and engaging our feelings from a holistic point of view. So the process of the working with the Quantum Navigator is about taking the steps to slowly starting to reopen the emotional body, re-engage it on a holistic level, because it's inside of the emotional body that calls all your disassociated parts back home. And it's the process working with the Quantum Navigator that helps guides all these parts back to ourselves so that we're holistic once again and employing our full emotional body, being present right here in the moment, find the greatest peace. And that happens when we disassemble all of the obstructions between our dualities.
But all this work, basically, as you mentioned, works on the holographic level.
Yes.
So
yes.
it really traverses time and space, working with this issue, whether it's a past life or whether it's a current life. It's kind of like the house of cards, or the dominoes, the domino effect.
Yes.
Right? So it basically changes the holographic fractal of us when we do this type of work. And that's one of the reasons we've gotten so excited about it. We've seen the results.
Yes. The process of moving out of the mental world and enjoying a much vaster world of the emotional body is a experience of paradise.
But not exchanging one for the other. We're talking about an
integrating
yes.
both. Yes.
Integration process.
And I remember that in the beginning, it was very difficult to speak an emotional language to an intellectual being. And so we had to translate, we had to take time to forge how to translate this information from the emotional world, which is integrative of both, into the intellectual world in a process that helped move, little by little, another individual back into that emotional ocean, the quantum ocean.
Obviously, there's a lot more to it, and we are still figuring out really how to present it in a way that's very simple and easy to understand. Ron gives workshops. Usually they're 2-day workshops in Phoenix, Arizona, here where we are now, sometimes in Tokyo, sometimes in Europe as well. So if you check our website, you can find out when the next workshop is in your location. Of course, if you have any questions, you can always email Ron, and he'll be happy to answer the questions in terms of whether the work is right for you. After this video, you'll see some text with the website and email information and all of that. So we hope that this has given you an exciting window in to what quantum navigation is, and also the potentials for how it can be used for you and your spiritual growth as well. Any final words?
No, but thank you very much for your interest.
Thank you. See you next time.